It's 5:05 and welcome into a Wednesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Republican Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin alongside two Republican state Senate candidates in Ashley Adams and Stacey McGuinn are seeking the North Carolina Supreme Court to intervene in a case challenging ballot counting rules for overseas voters. Their involvement stems from narrow election losses and ongoing protests alleging irregularities, including unlawful voting by non-residents. The case, which is Kivett, K-I-V-E-T-T, versus the North Carolina State Board of Elections, questions the state's application of the Uniform Military and Overseas Voting Act, which permits certain non-residents to vote if tied to North Carolina through paternal residency. However, the challenge is that those folks have never actually lived in the state of North Carolina. The GOP candidates aim to file an amicus brief arguing that non-residents voting violates the state constitution and could potentially affect their election outcomes. Lower courts in the state have rejected the GOP-led lawsuit, finding no evidence of fraud and upholding of the election board's interpretation of that Uniform Military and Overseas Voting Act. The Republican National Committee and the North Carolina GOP are also seeking to overturn lower court rulings in additional cases. The Democrats, including the State Election Board and the Democrat National Committee, as you can imagine, oppose that case, citing its potential to disenfranchise military and overseas voters. A state Superior Court judge previously ruled that no fraudulent activity under the Uniform Military and Overseas Voter Act has been demonstrated, emphasized bipartisan support for the law since it was enacted back in 2011. The state Supreme Court obviously has not decided whether to hear this case or not. This was filed yesterday, so all of this is still shaking out as of early this morning. And obviously, as we head into the Thanksgiving holiday, you can imagine things will be delayed by a couple of days, but this will likely be something that we continue to track as we head into portions of next week. We'll keep an eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:07 on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. We've got new news out of our state capitol this morning in regards to another veto from Governor Roy Cooper. This is revolving around a Senate bill that was passed by the General Assembly dealing with hurricane relief. However, Governor Roy Cooper is calling that a sham. Donna King from the Carolina Journal's got details this morning. Some very strong words from Governor Roy Cooper. Donna, what do you make of this news that we're learning this morning?
Yeah, absolutely. So this bill, among other things, it puts the money that the state is now obligated for hurricane recovery at $1 billion. So that is part of the really good news. But Cooper has vetoed it because there are other elements in this bill. It's about 132 pages, and within it, it does things like transfer the appointment power for the North Carolina State Board of Elections from the governor to the state auditor. Well, in January, the state auditor will become Dave Bolick. So some of those, that chain of command, the appointment over things like Board of Elections to that Republican seat. Now, that's one of the things that the governor has objected to, saying that this is unconstitutional. It goes against the North Carolina Constitution in putting that appointment power in another body on this Council of State, but still within the executive branch. Takes it away from the governor. Also shifts around some of the authority over public schools in charter and in opportunity scholarships away from the incoming superintendent of public instruction and creates a new board to oversee them. So it does a few things that really are target issues for the outgoing Republicans, because until January, they're going to have a supermajority. And coming in January, in the new legislative session, they have a majority, but narrowly missed a supermajority in November's election.
And we've talked a lot about this. As you can imagine, Donna, not only Governor Cooper is talking about this piece of legislation, but we're also hearing from Democrats both in the House and the Senate about this as well. They claim that Republicans are playing politics with hurricane relief. In your assessment, is that a fair accusation to make about this, or is this the same situation as walking and chewing gum, which we're familiar with that?
Sure. I mean, I think that that is what it is. Look, playing politics is not limited to Republicans, certainly. But these are things that they have tried to take on other ways. I see some issues kind of built in with the State Board of Elections thing. One, State Board of Elections court cases have already determined that it needs to stay with the executive branch. But the legislature in legislation, very recently has tried to make it a bipartisan Board of Elections. Right now, the Board of Elections is controlled by whomever is in the governor's mansion. So in this case, Democrats, because the governor chooses them. And the state legislators have tried to make it bipartisan, saying, look, two or three appointments from each major party, and let the governor pick the chairman and give some unaffiliated voters representation on it. Well, that was a failed effort. Now it goes to the state auditor instead in this piece of legislation. Still not really getting to that bipartisan board. So I anticipate we'll see some legal wrangling afterwards.
Well, speaking of not necessarily the legal wranglings of this, but we have seen many a times throughout the last couple of years, the governor objects to things that Republicans in the legislature want to do, and the legislature comes back, and time over time, they override his veto. We are expecting that, sometime next week, as the General Assembly is going to be back in Raleigh?
Yes, so they are planning to come back the second week of December. So anticipate an override potentially for this piece of legislation. Now, if there are lawsuits filed, that may stop pieces and parts of it. But I think that we are expecting them to have a supermajority, a number of votes they need for an override. That said, coming into January, while they don't have a supermajority, Dustin Hall, the incoming speaker, has been nominated by the Republican caucus. A full vote won't come until January, but right now he's the nominee for the Republicans for speaker. He says they're working on having a functional majority, and they did that before Tricia Cotham switched parties last year. So I would anticipate that they will still have that kind of power of the override going into the term with Josh Stein. Now, whether Josh Stein has the sort of fast and loose with the veto stamp as well as the way Cooper did still remains to be seen. Cooper has vetoed more bills than all governors in North Carolina combined at this point. But remember, that only goes back to maybe the early 90s when the legislature gave him that veto power.
Well, speaking of this potential veto override, there was some hay made back when this legislation was originally passed in the House side that there were a couple of lawmakers, Republican lawmakers, out in Western North Carolina that initially voted against this. They only needed a simple majority to pass it out of the House. This could be interesting, as those Republicans right now have a very slim margin, a one-vote margin in the House for a veto override. Do we think that maybe some of these Western Republicans are fed up that some of this other legislation is in here like you were talking about, and it's not just hurricane relief?
Oh, for sure. You definitely heard some frustration there from members who represent communities far out west saying, look, this is a big tab coming. There's 50, something like, the only one who could really cover a $50 million tab would be the federal government. So the federal government is going to have to come in. And we saw Cooper go to Washington last week with a delegation. We've got Tillis and Budd, North Carolina senators, and several representatives have sent a letter to Joe Biden saying, look, you need to take these steps to help the people in Western North Carolina, including getting some shelter there. There are folks who still literally do not have a roof, and it's getting cold. So you're seeing our congressional delegations demanding of the Biden administration that they get some trailers down there, let people live on their property as the weather gets cold. The fact that that really has not started is alarming.
Yeah, no question about that. And it all comes down to, as we can expect, on a red tape and government bureaucracy over what is considered a flood zone, what is not. In this case, you've got people freezing because of some arbitrary FEMA rule as to where they can set up mobile trailers and modular homes. And as everybody has noted, as you told us in your firsthand experience, it's a real mess out in Western North Carolina still. And you mentioned $1 billion already from the state, and it's going to take billions more for us to even begin to get back to what normalcy looks like in some of these places out west.
Absolutely. And there's also this push with the SBA disaster loans. The Small Business Administration is out of disaster loan money, and the small businesses in Western North Carolina really are hurting right now. So Thom Tillis, North Carolina's Republican senator, has been urging the SBA to refill, or for Congress to refill the coffers of the SBA's disaster loan program for those small businesses. The issue is exactly what you're saying, Nick. We have all this red tape and all of this process, but every single day, people are living without a roof. Their businesses can't get back on track. And these communities, people will eventually decide that they need to, just for the sake of their families, move elsewhere. So some of these communities, for lack of help, will just cease to become what they once were.
It's a sad situation. We'll continue to track details on this veto from Governor Roy Cooper. You can read more details by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:15, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get a look at traffic this morning. Boomer Von Cannon's got the latest.
Hey, thank you, Nick. station.
Hot. It's 5:19. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Hey, you can now check out the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast wherever you get those, on your phone or on your computer. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour or visit WBT.com and hover over the podcast tab. The North Carolina State Board of Elections met yesterday to certify the November the 5th general election results, highlighting a record 73% voter turnout across the state with over 5.7 million ballots cast. The board confirmed the results of most races following the county canvass process. We talked in great detail about that with folks like Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation. That process verifies vote accuracy. However, certification was delayed for several contested races, including that North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice race and those few state Senate races that we were talking about earlier, due to pending recounts and protests. The unresolved Supreme Court race between Allison Riggs and Jefferson Griffin remains under recount and is complicated by a protest alleging conflict of interest involving a couple of members of the Board of Elections. As we look at the status of that recount this morning, 88 out of 100 counties have conducted their recount operations. The State Board of Elections has been producing updates throughout the days on these recounts. As of right now, Justice Griffin has netted 94 votes, which brings Democrat Allison Riggs' lead from 724 down to 630. There are 12 counties that remain in North Carolina with their recounting process that does have to be over today. They are Alamance, Bladen, Craven, Forsyth, Gates, Granville, Halifax, Hertford, Mecklenburg, Northampton, Randolph, and Wilson counties. Those 12, again, remain with their recount operations. That will be wrapped up today. The idea that the Republican in this case, and Jefferson Griffin, will be able to net 630 votes in those 12 counties is, of course, incredibly small. However, there are still some of those pending and outstanding legal challenges. We will keep an eye on that and pass any additional details as we get those along to you right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, 522 News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. The holiday shopping season is upon us, not only across the United States, but here in North Carolina. To get some more details on that this morning, I'd like to welcome Andy Ellen, the president and general counsel for the North Carolina Retail Merchants Association, to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning to talk about what that holiday season and how that's shaking up here across the state. Andy, thanks for the time. You've got a first annual report out this morning. Can you tell us a little details about that?
Yes. So we contracted with the Appalachian State University Center for Economic Research and Policy Analysis to do a deep dive in North Carolina, both on the importance of the retail industry, but especially as we head into the holiday season, what we're looking at economically for this holiday season, and hopefully a very, very successful one.
Well, the last couple of years have been really rough on people's paychecks, wallets, pocketbooks, however you'd like to describe it, with inflation. But with that, it looks like we're starting to see a little bit of a recovery, a little bit of a comeback. You're expecting holiday shopping to actually be up this year. What do those figures look like?
We are looking for holiday shopping to be up in North Carolina. Last year it was about $42.08 billion. We're expecting about $42.24 billion this year, which is a great increase. Again, some of that, there are some inflationary factors in some of those figures, but overall very positive. And that's even with a very shortened holiday season. We only have 4 weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So this year it's a little shortened. It's going to be a little more, intense. So we're going to have to make up our sales in a very timely manner.
Let's talk a little bit. You mentioned inflation there, and as you go through the full report, which will be available at carolinajournal.com, you do have to, of course, calculate inflation into that. How does that whole process work as you work with the folks over at App State and got this study together?
They have some formulas that they put together with looking at inflation and sort of a baseline of what it would be without inflation and what it ends up being with inflation. And, and that's something that we're seeing across the board. But it also, has other factors, not just the price of the good, but also the price of labor, the price of transportation, the price of energy, those things that all get factored into why something on the shelf may be more expensive this year than it was last year or this month rather than last month.
Andy, the elephant in the room, of course, is the devastation and continued cleanup and recovery out in western North Carolina. Were you able to factor that into your report, and what is some of that looking like?
They did take that into account in trying to do it. And again, for the first time we've done this, having to put that big a factor into it is unusual, and we hope very unusual. I hope we don't have one of those again. There is just so much unknown in the western part of the state. There are parts of the state out there that are recovering and coming back faster than others. There are other parts of it around the Blue Ridge Parkway, or you think about a Chimney Rock or a Lake Lure area that are just completely devastated. But you are seeing some increased activity. I saw, the Biltmore Estate is back open, the Grove Park is back open, but those shops from Biltmore Village right beside of the Biltmore Inn, were completely destroyed. So that's going to play a big factor into not only the sales, but the employees who would be getting a paycheck, who would be turning around and spending that in the economy. The question is, if you were a tourism employee, did you stay or did you go south to Hilton Head or Charleston or somewhere else to get a job so you could support your family, and you're no longer here generating that money in the economy. So a lot of unknown there. We're hoping, that consumers will go out and support those businesses in the western part of the state where they're able to take tourists or they're able to take visitors, and support those businesses. They really need it.
Yeah, and I think for tourism, most people, of course, assume the eastern half of the state, the coast, is super busy during the summertime. But as we've unfortunately learned, a lot of folks unfortunately learning this over the last couple of weeks and months, that the western half of the state, it's all based around tree peeping and checking out the snow and enjoying some of those activities out there. So that's, of course, we're continuing to follow that recovery. As you mentioned, Andy, a little while ago, this is your first annual report. Tell us why you decided to conduct this study, and presumably this will be something that we'll see for years to come from the Retail Association.
Yes, sir. So my counterpart in Ohio has been doing this for a number of years, but oftentimes we get calls from media or other entities looking for what is the economic forecast for North Carolina, not only on the holiday season, but also on things like back to school. And the retail sector supplies one out of every 4 jobs in North Carolina, so probably the largest private employer. We felt it was imperative for us to have the data so we could look at it and then baseline it going forward through the years to see how retail is doing in North Carolina, especially around the holiday season. So that was sort of the impetus for us doing this. And we're, again, very excited about the first one and looking forward to many, many more of these.
Outside of this report, tell us a little bit of the day-to-day activities and what you guys are involved in throughout the year.
So we were founded in 1902, so coming up on our 125th anniversary. Our job is to make North Carolina the best place to operate a retail business. Our primary focus has always been advocacy, both at the state level and a lesser extent at the congressional and local level. But we work on things like sales tax and alcohol laws. Big focus of late has been organized retail crime and shopping, in this case during the holiday season, making sure people are shopping safe, buying things from legitimate sources. And then another big factor has been a program we have called Shop and See, which is post-COVID. We want to focus on getting consumers back into their physical store, pushing away from the laptop and going in and remembering why they enjoyed shopping locally so much. Those retailers are there every single day supporting their community, whether it's sponsoring the Little League team or the high school football team or the theater program. If you look just recently, our members are the largest donators to the food banks every year. Our organization does a $50,000 a year scholarship, or $50,000 a year donation to the North Carolina food banks. And we actually just did another $50,000 one to the western part of the state just this last week. So we're supporting the communities our members are. We hope others will come out and do that. That's what our organization is based around.
Great report. Thanks for the time. Andy Allen joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Fascinating report. Appreciate Andy's time. It's 5:29, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get another look at the roadways on this busy travel day before Thanksgiving. Boomer Von Cannon's got the latest.
You got it, Nick. Very busy.
It's 5:36. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3. I'm Nick Craig. Good Wednesday morning to you. We've got breaking news out of our state capitol this morning. Governor Roy Cooper has vetoed Senate Bill 382, which included some $227 million for disaster relief in North Carolina, but also enacted sweeping changes to executive branch power. The bill transforms control of the North Carolina State Board of Elections from the governor's office to the state auditor's office and limits the authority over charter school appeals, relocates responsibilities within state agencies, and eliminates 2 Democrat judicial seats, replacing them with Republican-appointed judgeships. Governor Roy Cooper, as a Democrat, as you can imagine, criticized the legislation as unconstitutional and called it a political power grab, accusing Republicans of undermining the governor's duties and redirecting disaster relief funds away from affected communities. He highlighted provisions that strip power from the superintendent of public instruction and hinder efforts to improve unemployment benefits for disaster-impacted residents. Supporters of the bill, including Senate Leader Phil Berger, argue that the changes to the North Carolina State Board of Elections aim to eliminate partisan interference in election administrations. Opponents, including Democrat lawmakers and activist groups, label the bill a Republican attempt to consolidate power ahead of a Democratic administration, sparking protests during Senate debates that took place last week. The Republican-controlled legislature is expected to override Governor Roy Cooper's veto during a December session. We could potentially see that next week or the week after. The timeline on that not immediately clear yet, as this veto just came down yesterday. Cooper said this in a press release, quote, "This legislation was titled disaster relief, but instead violates the Constitution by taking appointments away from the next governor for the Board of Elections, the Utility Commission, and commander of the North Carolina Highway Patrol, letting political parties choose appellate judges and interfering with the Attorney General's ability to advocate for lower electric bills for customers. Instead of giving small business grants to disaster counties, it strikes a crucial blow by blocking the expansion for better unemployment benefits for people who have lost their jobs due to natural disasters." The governor also called it a sham, adding that it doesn't send money to Western North Carolina. However, the General Assembly at this point in time has already allocated more than $1 billion from the state's rainy day fund, which had about $4.5 billion in it, to this disaster relief out in Western North Carolina. This is likely to be one of the last political battles between Governor Roy Cooper, who, as you are aware, has termed out of the governor's mansion. He will be turning that over to current Democrat Attorney General Josh Stein and the Republican-led General Assembly. The Republicans currently have a supermajority, so presumably they could override this veto. They will not have a veto-proof majority heading into the next General Assembly session. Those new lawmakers will be sworn in early January, so we will track this after the Thanksgiving break and provide additional details here on the Carolina Journal News Hour and on our website, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:40, News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Once again, the state of North Carolina has a great honor of having one of our Christmas trees from Western North Carolina that will be displayed and is being displayed in the White House right now. To give us more details on that, Teresa Opeka from the Carolina Journal joins us this morning. Teresa, before we get into some of these details, I don't think most folks know North Carolina is a major producer of Christmas trees, which I guess if you spend time out west, you see all those little Christmas tree farms up and down the mountainsides, but it's a big business here in the state.
It is a big business, Nick. Thanks for having me. So yeah, it's number 2 in the country. I think it's right behind Oregon for the most, for producing Christmas trees in the country. So it's a big, big industry.
Tell us a little bit about one of these trees out in Western North Carolina and what opportunity it has up in Washington, D.C. this year.
Yeah, so there was a Christmas tree picked from Cartner's Christmas Tree Farm. That's in Newland and Avery County. It was chosen for the Blue Room at the White House this Christmas. So that is quite the honor. The tree was about 25 years old and it stood about 20 feet tall. And just like you see the pictures in my story, a beautiful tree. The family was there pictured by it also with one of the dogs of the owner. So a really, really great honor. The official designation was the 2024 Grand Champion Grower. And it was the National Christmas Tree Association's National Christmas Tree and Wreath Contest. That took place last year. So they have this every other year. And last year there was a Klein Church Nursery also had the same honor, being picked for the Blue Room, Fleetwood, Ashe County. So it's been 2 years in a row. It's a great honor. It's a great representation for Western North Carolina, especially this year after Helene ravaged that area.
Well, that was going to be exactly my next question. You can imagine the copious amounts of rain that they saw, reports of mudslides, and Teresa, whole communities being washed away. It's even amazing that there's anything in terms of Christmas trees coming out of Western North Carolina, but it seems like for the most part that business is operating pretty well.
It is. So for this year's season, they were not affected. They did pretty well, but from what I gather from when I did the interview for the story, that they did lose some 4-foot trees. I guess they've had those planted in the last few years, that it's going to take a toll in the years to come, due to some landslides, mudslides, if you will, everything that happened with all that rain and the winds that came with Helene. But for this year, they were not affected. Other tree farms in the area were not so lucky. They were affected for this year, but Cartner's was not. So that's it's good and bad what happened out there this year.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, this essential lagging effect that we might have to deal with. As you mentioned, this 25-foot tree obviously been probably able to withstand, and it did withstand some of the elements out there, but some of these smaller, weaker, younger trees, I guess, are just too short and couldn't bear some of the horrendous conditions out there.
Right. So what I was told, this is how the process goes. A seedling grows to about 8 to 12 inches, then it goes into the field, grows about a foot a year. So an 8-foot tree, it's been in the field for about 8 years, and then it was in the seed bed before that for 5. So an 8-foot tree is about 13 years old. So that tree was growing for about 5-6 years, maybe the ones that were destroyed. So they got to start over again from that point. So does grow somewhat fast, but it is a process to go through.
Yeah, no question about that. And again, the honor to have this North Carolina tree once again in the Blue Room. This, obviously, you mentioned this has happened the last 2 years, but this has been something that North Carolina's had the honor for, not just in the Blue Room, but even up in Washington, D.C. in general, for quite some time now. This is not necessarily new.
No, it's not. I believe it's about 14 years. It seems like it's been or 14 times rather that 14 years that they've been chosen for that honor. So yeah, it's nothing new for North Carolina, but it is a great honor, to have that for the White House.
You can read more on Teresa's story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. It's 545, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
It's 5:51. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Good Wednesday morning to you. Holiday spending in North Carolina is projected to grow in 2024, with total sales reaching $42.24 billion, which is a modest increase from where it was last year at $42.08 billion. That's according to a first annual report from the North Carolina Retail Merchants Association. They conducted the study alongside Appalachian State's University Center for Economic Research and Policy Analysis. The forecast, which covers the months of November and December, predicts a 1.6% dip in November in sales compared to 2023. However, a 2.2% rise in the month of December, when holiday shopping typically peaks. According to the president and general counsel of the Retail Merchant Association, Andy Ellen, he talked about this study. He joined us earlier this morning, and he mentioned that because Thanksgiving is so late this year, that's why December has that more of an uptick than compared to the downturn, the slight dip of 1.6% in the month of November. He also expressed excitement about this inaugural study, noting its importance for tracking retail trends in the state. However, with all of that said, economic uncertainty does linger in portions of western North Carolina, where communities at this hour are still recovering from Hurricane Helene. Areas like Chimney Rock and Lake Lure remain devastated, although some key tourist attractions, such as the Grove Park Inn and the Biltmore Estates, have resumed at least partial operations in some of those cases. Ellen stressed the need for consumers to support businesses in those affected regions to boost the local economy. However, inflation continues to weigh on consumer minds and concerns, with 36.6% of respondents in the November Carolina Journal poll citing it as their top election issue earlier this month and one of the issues that drove them out to vote. Ellen highlighted that inflation impacts more than just prices. It influences costs of labor, transportation, and energy, all of which heavily affects the retail industry. And of course, some of those costs absolutely trickle down to you and affect the price of goods on the store shelves and different things that you are buying. You can read more on that study and check out my interview with Andy Ellen from the North Carolina Retail Merchants Association by visiting carolinajournal.com. Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin, alongside two Republican state Senate candidates Ashley Adams and Stacey McGinn, are seeking the North Carolina Supreme Court to intervene in a case challenging ballot counting rules for overseas voters. Their involvement stems from a narrow election loss and ongoing protests alleging irregularities, including unlawful voting by non-residents. The case is Kivett, K-I-V-E-T-T, versus the North Carolina State Board of Elections, and it questions the state's application of the Uniform Military Overseas Voter Act, which permits certain non-citizens and non-residents to vote if they are tied to North Carolina through some form of parental residency. The GOP candidates aim to file an amicus brief arguing that non-resident voting violates the state constitution and could affect the outcomes of their elections. Lower courts have already rejected GOP-led challenges, finding no evidence of fraud and upholding the election board's interpretation of that Overseas and Military Voting Act. The Republican National Committee, alongside the North Carolina GOP, are also seeking to overturn lower court rulings. Democrats, including the State Board of Elections and the Democrat National Committee, oppose the case and cite its potential to disenfranchise military and overseas voters. A state Superior Court judge previously ruled that no fraudulent activity under the Uniform Military and Overseas Voter Act has been demonstrated, emphasizing bipartisan support for the new law that was enacted back in 2011. Because this just happened yesterday, we don't know whether or not the state's highest court and the Supreme Court will hear this case or not. Keeping our attention on election news this morning, the North Carolina State Board of Elections, the NCSBE, did meet yesterday to certify the November the 5th general election results, highlighting a record 73% voter turnout with more than 5.7 million ballots cast across the state. The board confirmed the results of most races following the county canvass process, which took place over the last couple of weeks, which verifies vote accuracy. However, certification was delayed for several contested contests, one of those being the North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice race. And as we look at details in that race this morning, there are 12 counties that continue with their recount efforts. This is a machine recount, so ballots are simply being run through high-speed scanners in those states. As of right now, the Republican in Jefferson Griffin has netted 94 votes throughout the recount, bringing Democrat Allison Riggs down from 724 votes to 630 votes. Those 12 counties with recounts remaining include Alamance, Bladen, Craven, Forsyth, Gates, Granville, Halifax, Hertford, Mecklenburg, Northampton, Randolph, and Wilson. We'll continue to track those details throughout the day today. That's going to do it for a Friday or a Wednesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. We've got the true meaning and the true story of Thanksgiving coming up for you tomorrow morning at 5, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Have a great Thanksgiving.